narrative documentary, solemn, objective, and epic, balancing historical neutrality with controlled dramatization. The desert wind had barely lifted the dust from the convoy tracks when Captain Elizaida radioed back, "We have reached the pass. No resistance yet. Advancing." His unit had parachuted east of Mitla, a narrow gorge slicing through the Sinai. What looked like a tactical maneuver was, in truth, the opening move of a political illusion. It was October 29, 1956. Israel, Britain, and France were about to wage a war they couldn't afford to admit. Their secret plan? Have Israel strike first, triggering a neutral Anglo-French intervention that would restore order by retaking the Suez Canal. The Protocol of Sèvres, signed just 5 days earlier, laid out the script. Israel pushes into Sinai. Britain and France then call for a ceasefire. When Egypt refuses, they invade the Canal Zone. On paper, it was coordinated. In reality, it was stitched together by haste, vengeance, and incomparable goals. France, still bleeding from Algeria and humiliated in Indochina, saw Egypt as the root of all colonial unrest. Britain feared losing not just the canal, but the last shreds of empire. Israel, squeezed by Egyptian Fedayeen raids, irregular guerrilla attacks, and Soviet-supplied weapons, saw a rare chance to break free. But they never aligned on what came next. There was no joint command, no exit plan, no margin for delay. The entire operation depended on deception and speed before Washington or Moscow could react. The campaign began flawlessly. Israeli columns rolled deep into Sinai. British and French aircraft bombed Egyptian airfields. By November 5th, paratroopers were descending on Port Said. But while tanks advanced, the alliance unraveled. At the United Nations, Secretary General Hammarskjöld called an emergency session. The United States, fearing Soviet escalation and furious at being left out, condemned the invasion. President Eisenhower, mid-re-election, issued an ultimatum: withdraw or face economic retaliation. He even threatened to let the British pound collapse. Here's the real impact. Within 24 hours, the military success became a diplomatic rout. Britain and France announced a ceasefire. Israel, isolated, was forced to pull back weeks later. In practice, the Allies had stormed Suez, only to discover they couldn't hold it without global consent. They had won the canal, but lost Washington, and in the Cold War, that meant they lost the war. Suez marked the moment post-imperial Europe realized no battlefield victory could outlast a superpower's disapproval. For General Moshe Dayan, the decision to strike first was never about prestige. It was about living past the next war. By late 1956, Israel's security cabinet had mapped a rising pattern: more frequent Fedayeen incursions, heavier Egyptian arms, and now a Czech-Egyptian arms deal backed by the Soviets. In one briefing, Dayan put it simply: "We can act now or be surrounded later with worse odds." Ben-Gurion agreed, but added a layer: if Israel had to fight, why not fight with leverage? Here lay the pivot. The alliance with France and Britain offered an opening, but at a cost: secrecy, dependency, and the risk of global condemnation. The strategic gamble wasn't just military, it was existential. Was this a war of necessity or a war of opportunity? In essence, Israel believed that a short, sharp blow could reset the map and force Egypt to retreat from its posture of encirclement. The plan required speed. From the Negev, armored columns would fan out across Sinai, aiming to cut off Egypt's logistics and signal resolve. Paratroopers were to seize choke points, while Ariel Sharon, commanding the 202nd Paratrooper Brigade, would attempt a controversial flanking move through the Mitla Pass without clearance from high command. Mitla Pass, a narrow gorge in central Sinai, vital for controlling east-west movement and notoriously dangerous for mechanized units. The risk was real. If Israel's advance stalled, it could face isolation, counterattack, and diplomatic backlash. But the logic was cold. If not now, when? And just as expected, the operation gained ground fast. In under 3 days, Israel's forces reached the approaches of Sharm el-Sheikh, threatening Egypt's access to the Gulf of Aqaba, its lifeline to the Red Sea. That move, while strategic, came with symbolic weight. Controlling the Gulf would end Egypt's blockade on Israeli shipping, a grievance dating back to 1950. It wasn't just about maps. It was about movement, sovereignty, and deterrence. One Israeli radio operator intercepting Egyptian panic chatter near Abu Hujelet laughed. "They thought we wouldn't cross the desert. We crossed it in 2 days." But that pride would face fast when the UN resolution landed. Israel won ground, but in doing so exposed the fragile threads holding its alliances and its narrative of self-defense together. In 1956, France wasn't just fighting Egypt, it was fighting the memory of defeat. Barely 2 years had passed since Dien Bien Phu, the devastating loss in Indochina. Now, in Algeria, a brutal war was underway against a nationalist insurgency, funded, trained, and armed in part by Nasser's Egypt. To French strategists like Guy Mollet, this wasn't just geopolitics, it was personal. Nasser had become, in their eyes, the supplier of revolutions, the modern Saladin, undermining French prestige across continents. By mid-1956, French cabinet no longer debated if Nasser should be struck, but how to do it without triggering international backlash. For Paris, Suez was not just a canal, it was a stage to reverse humiliation and send a message to rebels from Algiers to Saigon. The empire strikes back. This explains why France pushed so hard for the Protocol of Sèvres and why it accepted the secrecy clause so easily. French diplomats even floated the idea of turning the Suez attack into a test run for new tactical cooperation between NATO and Israel, a radical concept at the time. The deeper reason: Paris believed that an Anglo-French-Israeli victory would decapitate Nasser's regional influence and stop the FLN from receiving weapons through Egyptian ports. But this logic led to a dangerous narrowing of vision. A French officer, when briefing paratroopers bound for Port Said, reportedly said, "This is not about Egypt. It's about every Frenchman who died in Indochina." That sentiment, while sincere, blurred the line between strategy and revenge. As bombs fell on Egyptian airfields, French media framed the war as restoring order. But outside Europe, the image was darker. 3 former empires ganging up on a post-colonial state. The message intended for rebels now echoed as proof of Western imperial arrogance. In trying to crush a symbol, France made Nasser larger and turned Suez into a propaganda gift for every anti-colonial movement from Morocco to Jakarta. To British planners in 1956, the Suez Canal wasn't just a waterway, It was a lifeline. Nearly two-thirds of Western Europe's oil passed through it. And with Iranian fields already unstable, Egypt had become the critical node in Britain's energy grid. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, once Churchill's protege, saw Nasser not as a nationalist, but as a would-be dictator in the mold of Mussolini. But the real fear ran deeper. With the pound sterling already under pressure and the empire shrinking fast, losing the canal meant losing relevance in the post-war world. And so Eden chose a drastic path. Strike now, deceive Washington if necessary, and use force to regain the initiative. In a private meeting, Eden reportedly said, "We must finish him. If we don't, our position in the Middle East is finished." That urgency led to the agreement at Chevs, where Britain accepted a plan it could barely control. Paradoxically, Britain, a global maritime power, entered Suez with no clear naval exit, militarily strong, but politically blind. The logistical setup reflected this. British forces relied on airfields in Cyprus and Malta, had to coordinate with French units across languages and doctrines, and faced increasing skepticism from their own public. Eden's government also underestimated Eisenhower's resolve. In London's view, the U.S. would tolerate the intervention, or at worst, abstain. Instead, Eisenhower issued a financial warning. If Britain didn't withdraw, the U.S. would let the pound collapse. When Port Said fell to British commandos, the military seemed triumphant. But in the streets of Calcutta, Karachi, and Khartoum, crowds marched in protest. And at the UN, Britain found itself isolated, not just from the USSR, but from its closest ally. The Suez victory came too late and cost too much. In trying to prove it still mattered, Britain exposed how little it could do alone and accelerated its retreat from empire.
On November 6, 1956, the world witnessed something almost unthinkable. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in Cold War rivalry, co-sponsored a UN resolution demanding a ceasefire in Egypt. Behind closed doors, diplomats called it the veto of allies. Both superpowers had watched the Anglo-French-Israeli offensive unfold with unease, but for very different reasons. UN Resolution 997, emergency measure calling for immediate ceasefire and troop withdrawal during the Suez Crisis. For the U.S., the concern was strategic balance. President Eisenhower, running for re-election, feared that unchecked Western aggression would alienate the Arab world and drive it into Moscow's arms. For the USSR, the invasion was a provocation near its sphere of influence. On November 5, Moscow sent direct threats to Paris, London, and Tel Aviv, including veiled suggestions of missile strikes. This wasn't about Egypt. It was about keeping the Cold War cold. In a rare diplomatic alignment, both powers used every tool. The U.S. threatened financial collapse by selling off sterling reserves. They could crash the British economy overnight. The Soviets escalated rhetorically, calling the invasion aggression and hinting at military action. Faced with this pressure, the tripartite alliance crumbled. Canadian diplomat Lester Pearson, appalled by the paralysis at the UN, proposed a novel idea, a neutral peacekeeping force under UN command. It would be the first of its kind, and it passed. Thus was born the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, deployed to separate Israeli and Egyptian troops. It marked a new diplomatic era, peace enforced by international legitimacy, not imperial firepower. By late November, all invading forces began their withdrawal. Nasser, bloodied but unbroken, emerged stronger, both at home and across the Arab world. The Suez Crisis ended not with surrender, but with a new reality. The age of unilateral Western interventions was over. Superpowers now held the leash, even on their friends.
When Israeli tanks rolled back from the Sinai, when French paratroopers boarded ships at Port Said, when British diplomats returned from a UN they no longer controlled, something fundamental had shifted. Suez didn't just end a war, it ended a way of thinking. For Israel, the war proved its military skill, but also its limits. The world now saw it not as a desperate defender, but as a regional actor capable of launching joint operations with global powers. That visibility would shape every war to come. For France, the lesson was cruel and final. Colonial power couldn't be restored by force. Within 6 years, Algeria would be independent. Paris stopped looking to the Middle East and started building Europe. For Britain, the damage was psychological as much as strategic. The illusion of global leadership collapsed. Harold Macmillan, who replaced Eden, privately called Suez the last gasp of the empire. From that point forward, London would align itself more tightly with Washington and follow. Suez turned 3 powers into followers of pressure, of backlash, of time. And for the wider world, Nasser, though militarily outmatched, emerged as the David who stood against 3 Goliaths. His portrait hung in cafes from Casablanca to Jakarta. He had lost land, but won narrative. And in the Cold War, that often mattered more. The canal was reopened under Egyptian control. The United Nations Emergency Force remained on site for a decade. And never again would the US or USSR tolerate such blatant unilateralism from their allies. Was Suez the last imperial war or the first post-imperial one? Either way, it was the moment when strategy bowed to image and when winning meant knowing when not to fight.